Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Trusted CI webinar for May 19th, 2025. I'm your host, Jeanette Dopp-Heide. Trusted CI is the NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and these webinars are part of its mission to deliver high-quality, actionable guidance regarding cybersecurity to the NSF community. More information can be found at trustedci.org. Today's topic is conducting responsible human-centered AI research with Dr. Bart Knienenbuch. Bart is an associate professor at Human-Centered Computing at Clemson University, where he co-directs the Humans and Technology Lab, the HAT Lab. His research explores the social, societal, and psychological aspects of human interaction with intelligent systems. His research has been funded by the NSF, including the Career Award, the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, Department of Justice, and corporate gifts. Before we begin, I have a few things to note. First, this presentation is being recorded. Second, participants are welcome to ask questions during the session. I know there are going to be some kind of scheduled chunks and breaks during this presentation, so that might also be a good time to hop in and ask a question. But we'll also probably have time at the end as well. So with that, I think we've covered everything. I'll hand things over to Bart. Bart, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeanette, for the introduction, and thank you all for showing up here and being here. Yeah, I'm going to be talking today about human-centered AI research and how to conduct this research in a responsible manner. So this is work that I've done with the HAT Lab, and I'll acknowledge them in a few slides. But first, I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about, conducting human subjects research in a responsible way, considering AI systems. And I want to first explain, why would you even do this, right? Like, why would you conduct human subjects research in this area? And then I'm going to help any of you who might be interested in doing this in a responsible manner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how many participants should you recruit for your study, what demographics should you collect about your study participants, how should you obtain informed consent and IRB approval for your study, and kind of like what are the intricacies around that, and then how should you run your study in a way that kind of optimizes participation. So a lot of this, the second and third question here are actually motivated by the NSF SigCHI grant that we got, where Dr. Kelly Kane is the lead PI. But as many of you will know, when you start doing research, you start doing all kinds of side projects at the same time. So this is kind of the culmination of both the work from the SigCHI project as well as other projects that I'm doing. And this is the first time I'm presenting all of this. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on the practical side of it. So mostly presenting results, not so much methods. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask. But I want to make this very practical, give you some guidelines on how to do this type of research. Here you see a nice photo of the members of the HAT Lab. For the particular results that I'm going to share today, here's the list of collaborators. Believe it or not, the lab is even bigger than that. There's even more people involved. But yeah, I'm indebted to the hard work and diligence of these people when I present these results today. All right, so let's jump right in. Why should you conduct human subjects studies on AI? And, this brings me back to the very first human subject study that I did on the topic of AI back in 2007. Yes, that's how old I am. So in this study, I built a mobile agent for the Dutch railway system. I was back at the University of Eindhoven back then. And so this was a rudimentary intelligent agent where, you had this kind of faked mobile interface where people would kind of type questions to the agent and it would respond. And you could ask it things about like departure times, connecting platforms, ticket prices, all kinds of things like that, right? And, one of the things that we found there was that if this agent did not have some human capabilities, like an understanding of past questions that you asked it, or an understanding of the context of where you are at the moment. But it looked very human, then people would be very confused with it not having those capabilities. And we know that even today, some of these AI systems actually don't have those capabilities, right? If you ask your voice assistant a question, if you ask it a follow-up question, it often doesn't actually understand. And people really struggle with that because it sounds like a human, right? So we did this study in 2007. We submitted it for publication. Funny story. The first set of reviews that I got was, oh, we all know that Clippy doesn't work. So they rejected it. I put it in a file drawer. I submitted it again to a conference in 2014. And then I got the reviews that, oh, this is the most relevant work at the moment, really prescient for the for the time. So it was kind of a study that was ahead of its time, right? But because it was 2007, we actually didn't build this AI agent, right? The technology just wasn't there to do this natural language processing. What it actually was a digital Wizard of Oz study, right? So participants would ostensibly talk to this agent, but what it really was kind of like a chat protocol, an instant messaging system in disguise, right? So I was actually behind the scene puppeteering the agent and giving the answers based on the experimental condition that the user was in, right? So this was a first version of an AI-based study. This was by no means the very first study on AI, but the first time that I did it. Now, fast forward to 2025, I'm now a professor at Clemson, and my students are doing research on AI-based systems all the time. And it's actually fairly simple to do this, right? This is an example from a student who graduated literally 1 week ago. And so she built this video tutorial for older adults to teach them about privacy. And we built in this chatbot where people can pause the video and ask clarifying questions. And it's powered under the hood by ChatGPT. And it was, it wasn't easy to build it, but it was doable, right? We can actually leverage these systems now for these types of experiences. All right, so we have these cool, nifty new AI tools based on these LLM systems. And we want to know, do they actually work, right? Like, yes, they work, but at the same time, we know that there's problems with hallucinations. We don't know if they're always giving fair answers, if their accuracy is fairly distributed across the population. We still have these usability issues that I uncovered like more than a decade ago. So we should evaluate these systems when we build them. And these AI tools, they come from the area of machine learning, which originally was doing kind of, their goal was to find the best item from a large set of items for a certain user or for a certain query, right? Like for a certain query, think Google. For a certain user, think Netflix, right? So you can evaluate those kinds of algorithms if you have an annotated benchmark data set, right? Because then you can just run the algorithm on the benchmark data set, have a little bit of a holdout, and then see how accurate it is. But if you have generative AI, you can't do that, right? Because the item doesn't exist, right? The response is completely novel. Also, even if you would evaluate the system like this, it doesn't really capture the user experience, right? It doesn't capture how people interact with these systems. There's more to it than just giving the right answer, right? So how do we evaluate these systems? Well, the best way to do it is using these human subject studies, right? So there's two kinds of broad flavors of this. You have qualitative studies where you try to get to kind of people's understandings and their perceptions in a qualitative manner. You can do that by observing them interact with a system, by interviewing them about their use of these systems, by doing something like a diary study or a focus group, right? That's the qualitative side. Or you can do it in a quantitative way using a controlled lab experiment or a field trial like an A/B test or something like a survey, and you can quantify their perceptions and their behaviors basically. All right, and if you're interested in this, this is not the topic of this webinar, but if you are interested in human subject studies for AI systems, I wrote on this topic quite extensively. There's a paper called Explaining the User Experience of Recommender Systems. I come from the area of recommender systems. And this framework that I present in that paper, I have a figure of it here. It's actually been being applied to AI systems more and more now, because we realize again that those offline studies don't work on those systems. I wrote a handbook chapter on how to do these types of studies, and I'm actually about to embark on a year-long adventure of actually writing a textbook on this topic, right? So this is going to come out at some point, and I'll share it with the Trusted CI community once it does. But today I'm going to talk about when you run these studies, how do you deal with participant privacy? Right? So when you run human subject studies, the privacy of subjects, of research subjects, is actually regulated in many cases by some sort of ethics review board, right? In the United States, it would be the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And so the IRB prescribes how to get informed consent from study participants. It has guidelines for how to optimize the privacy and confidentiality of your study data, especially when you're studying sensitive topics. Their goal is to really limit participant discomfort when they are doing a study, and they have additional protections for vulnerable populations, right? However, when it comes to AI studies, all of these things are more difficult, right? In terms of privacy and confidentiality, one thing we know from these machine learning and AI studies is that they often collect a ton of data, right? And especially with these large language models where people talk to them kind of in natural language, you cannot control what they say to you, right? If you're running a survey or even an interview, you can kind of steer the interview away from sensitive topics. You can easily avoid asking for confidential information. But with LLMs, you never know. Like when we were studying the privacy tutorial for older adults, we had the real concern of like, what if an older adult goes to this chatbot and says, my password is so-and-so, is this a good enough password, right? We don't want people to disclose that type of information, but we can't really control that, right? Even if people don't divulge their personal information, if you have these really large data sets, it's possible that people can be re-identified, right? It's difficult to anonymize them. If you know that I am from Clemson, that's probably okay. If you know that I'm a white male, that's probably okay. If you know that I'm from the Netherlands, that's probably okay. But if you know all of those things, there's just one of them in Clemson, right? So you can actually know who I am if you have all that data, even if you didn't collect my name or my email address. And then the question becomes, is all that information shared only with the researchers who have this obligation to protect that data, or is it also shared with the AI system, right? And if so, who owns that system, right? Does OpenAI have some sort of responsibility to handle that data responsibly? A very big question there, for example, is that data being used for training, right? If the data is being used for training the AI system, that means that some of that information can be leaked, right? So because anything that's coming up in training might actually be blurted out by this LLM at some point later on, right? So privacy and confidentiality in AI is very difficult. There's also the aspect of discomfort, right? Again, these AI systems, they usually try to respond in a personalized manner. They try to make inferences about people, and that can be confrontational, right? And it's also very difficult to control the AI behavior, right? On the one hand, we have this issue of hallucinations, but even if not, we really cannot control exactly what these AI systems do. I have a student who is building a chatbot that helps international students with their mental health. What if a student says, I want to harm myself, and the chatbot says, wants to please the user and says, if that's what you think you need to do, you should go and do it, right? That's a really bad thing. We don't want that to happen, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to be very, very careful about when we're doing AI research. Now, on top of that, we see an influx of people who are doing these studies who've never done these studies before, right? There's people in the field of machine learning who now realize, hey, I have to do a human subject study. They've never done that kind of research before, so they need some help and guidance. Or we have people from other fields who say, hey, we want to use AI in our studies. They don't necessarily know what the benefits and risks of using AI might be, right? And in some cases, the problem is both. um, and then on top of that, sometimes the ethics review boards also don't really know how to assess AI studies, right? So these are the problems that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to try and give you some guidance on how to deal with these problems. All right, so we will start with a seemingly simple question of how many participants should I recruit for the study that I'm going to conduct, right? So the first question is, well, why is that important? Well, if you don't collect enough data, or if you have too few participants in your study, if you're doing a quantitative study, it basically means that you may not find statistical significance, even if there's a relevant effect in your data, right? So you do a very small study, you don't find an effect. That doesn't mean that there's no effect there. It might simply be that you're not collecting enough data, right? And that's a bit of a waste if you're running a study with not enough participants to get statistical significance. Regardless of the type of study, there's also the problem of a lack of coverage, right? If you have a small sample of participants, you may not capture the wide variety of people that are out there in the world that might be using the system that you're evaluating. And so both of these issues combined means that you might miss very important insights when you are doing a study that's small, too small. On the other hand, you also don't want to run a study with too many study participants, right? If you have a really large sample size, statistically, that basically means that a lot of things can become statistically significant, even things that are not very substantial, right? Like very small differences that don't have a meaningful implications, they might become statistically significant. So what you're doing is you're basically, you're wasting time and money by doing this. But you're also, to some extent, putting participants' privacy at risk, right? If we think about, again, the mandate of the IRB is to minimize overall discomfort. And so especially if you have a study that has kind of a sensitive topic, it makes sense to not subject too many participants to your admittedly experimental procedure, right? You want to make sure that you are doing this with an adequate number of participants, but not too many. All right, so I want to take a very short break here and do a little bit of participant participation and ask the attendees of this webinar, have you run a study like this? And if so, how do you determine your sample size? And so feel free to post your answer in the chat. There might be multiple answers. There's no single correct answer. I have a couple of examples here on this slide. If you're doing a quantitative study, people's typical go-to is to do a power analysis, right? This is basically a calculation to find out how many participants you need in order to find an effect that is there of a certain size with statistical significance. If you're doing a qualitative study, usually what you're doing is you're trying to discover themes in your data, right? And so often the guidance is to collect participants until you feel like you're not learning anything new from new participants, right? So this is called saturation of themes, right? You may also have considerations of stratification, so that you need a certain diversity of representativeness in your data to be able to say, for example, I want my study to apply to both older and younger adults or to all different genders, right? But importantly, you may also have practical constraints, right? You may simply not have the funding to have a large sample, or the time, or it might just be very difficult to find participants for the type of study that you're trying to run, right? So I have a whole list of reasons here that people cite for gathering their sample in the way they do. And, again, none of these is the perfect answer, but, these are just some things that you can do. And two of the things that I'm going to talk about today are the power analysis and this idea of let's look at what everyone else in the field is doing, right? So local standards. So when it comes to local standards, we've done work on this topic for quite a long time. My colleague, Dr. Kelly Kane, did a first study on this at CHI, the ACM Conference on Human-Computer Interaction. That's kind of the top conference in human-computer interaction. And so she analyzed all of the papers at CHI 2014 to find out, okay, what is the sample size of the studies reported in these papers, right? And so here you see some results. On the left side, you see for each different study method, the mean sample size by method on the left side for in-person studies and on the right side for remote studies. And you obviously see that remote studies can have a much larger sample size. But even, in-person studies, if you do an experimental study, you need a certain number of participants to, get that statistical significance. And so looking at what other people are doing in the field is a really useful way of getting a feel of like what is commonly accepted, right? We replicated this at the Intelligent User Interfaces Conference in 2024. And because I was one of the co-chairs, we could do this not just on the accepted papers, but on all of the submissions, right? So we also looked at a comparison between rejected papers and accepted papers. And we see, not much has changed from 2014. Also, there's not a huge difference between rejected and accepted papers, right? You see that for surveys and questionnaires, the median number of participants actually in rejected submissions was higher, almost 40, whereas in accepted submissions about 21. And then for interview studies, it seems to be about 15 as the median sample size. So this is a qualitative study, right? And then we decided let's do a more thorough version of this. So this is a paper that's still in submission, so please don't quote from it yet. But we looked at all of the papers from CHI 2017 to 2024, so almost a decade's worth of CHI papers, to see what is the sample size, both for in-person studies per method and for remote studies per method. At the bottom, you see the numbers. That's the number of studies that had this design. And then you see the sample size. This is on a log scale on the y-axis, right? So you see that indeed, again, in-person studies, for most study types, it's a small sample size. There's a couple of really ambitious lab studies. They are probably multi-institutional. And then you have these remote studies that tend to be a lot larger, right? But even their longitudinal studies tend to be quite a bit smaller because, you need to engage participants for a longer amount of time. An interesting side note here, in evaluating, this is over 500 papers, we found 2 papers that did not report the sample size of their study, which we thought was kind of ironic. And these were accepted papers, right? So they're kind of interesting. Sometimes the reporting is not excellent, and we should do a little bit better job of that. All right, so that's local standards. The other thing I mentioned was power analysis. Again, this is ongoing work, so I'm going to be very quick about this. Power analysis is difficult, and there's not that many good tools to do it. I think the most usable tool that's out there that kind of most people use now is G-Power. You write that G star power. And most people have kind of a love-hate relationship with G-Power. It's kind of complicated, especially if you're not an expert statistician. So we're actually in the process of building a more user-friendly tool that doesn't argue from the perspective of a statistician, but from the perspective of an experimentalist, right? So actually asks you questions not about your statistical design, but about your experimental design, and then gives you a guidance on how to define the sample size based on that. So we're trying to do better. Here you see kind of an alpha version of the tool. And once we have a reasonable beta version, again, I will definitely make sure to share that with the trusted CI community for people to use. Are there questions at this point? Because this is a nice break here.
I don't see any so far.
Great. Then I will move on to the next topic. Of course, there's also time for questions at the end if I go quick enough. So the next question is, let's say we know how many participants we want to recruit. What should we ask them, right? What do we need to know about them? Again, why is this important? Well, we want to know the context of a study that we conduct, right? If we do a study with human subjects, we kind of want to know, how old are these participants on average? Like, where did you recruit them? What is their kind of gender makeup, etc. This is very important to kind of contextualize these results. Also for reproducibility, right? If you're going to reproduce a study and if you find different results, is that because the results were kind of not very robust, or is it because you have a different type of sample here, right? It's also important to collect this information if you want to balance the sample or if you want to have a coverage in a specific sample, right? In the study on privacy education for older adults, we did collect both an older adult and younger adult sample, and we had to collect people's age in order to, determine which group that people fell into, right? That also then allows you to test for fairness across certain demographics, right? These AI systems, we know that they tend to have better outcomes for white male users, right? So if we want to make sure that they are fair to all genders and all races, then we should collect that information so that we can see if that is the case. And you can use this also to uncover moderation effects. So again, for the older adult privacy education studies, we actually showed that the best modality to provide privacy education to users differs for older and younger adults. And so that difference between older and younger adults is a very interesting finding, which you can only know that if you collect people's age, obviously. That doesn't mean you have to go all out in collecting demographics, right? Because, obviously some demographics are considered private information. People don't want to disclose this. If you collect too many of these demographics, you run the risk of being able to re-identify the participants. I mentioned that earlier, right? And participants might feel some discomfort disclosing these demographics, even if you are protected by IRB, even if you have a very nice consent form that explains how that data will be used. People are not always happy disclosing their personal information, even in a research study, right? And obviously, this will get worse when you're also collecting all this AI interaction data that you can't really carefully control, right? And when you're combining all that data, you run the risk of, really jeopardizing study participants' privacy. One thing that's important to realize is that, I probably don't have to tell this audience, but people differ a lot in terms of like how they feel about privacy. And this is also true for research studies. I will quote from my own dissertation study. Again, this is about a decade ago, where I created a recommender system that asks a large array of demographic questions to personalize a health recommender. And so users really varied in how much they appreciated these data collection practices, right? So this person on the left here is very skeptical about it. It's like, you're asking people about their health, that makes sense, but you're also requesting information about, how they vote in elections, what their sexual preferences. This person gets a little snippy here, like the size of the beer bottle you're drinking. Like I really don't think you should be asking these kinds of things. The interesting thing is, when you have an AI system, all of this information might to some extent be relevant, right? Even to the extent that users might not realize it. But obviously it becomes very circumspect when you're asking all these kinds of information. Now, in the very same study, there was another participant who said, the questions that you ask seem too generic, and then went on to present their entire life story in like an open answer question, saying like, oh, you also need all this information in order to give me health recommendations, right? So you see this very different perspective on how people feel about the privacy of their personal information and their demographics, right? Conversely, when you are collecting these demographics, there's also different ways in which you can ask these questions, right? Even something as simple as a person's age. On the left here, you see how the US Census asks about age. And obviously, the census needs to have this information in quite a bit of detail. So it asks you both your age in years, but also your actual date of birth, right? Like your literal date of birth needs to be reported. I don't recommend that you do that in your human subject study, right? Because you often don't need the information at that level of granularity. So a much better question is the one on the right, where you just ask, what is your age in years? And where you even explicitly give people the option to not answer that question so that they can continue with the study without dropping out, still gain the benefits, but not have that discomfort of disclosing a piece of information that they don't want to disclose, right? So another question is, again, how do people currently do this? Right? So I go back to the data I collected from the Intelligent User Interface Conference in 2024, where we find that across both the accepted and rejected papers, the top demographics that people seem to collect are gender, sex, age, technology experience, which makes sense for an intelligent user interfaces conference, education, name and email address. Now, that's something that they typically don't report in the paper, obviously, but they may need for compensation, right? The email address to send people a gift card or something like that. And name, if you have an AI-based system, it's nice for the system to be able to address you by name, right? So people do often ask for participants' names in those cases, which again is personally identifiable information, and their occupation. So these are the top demographics. Are at least some of these demographics included in the paper? 81% of accepted papers said yes, we included a nice overview of these demographics in the paper. 61% of rejected papers did as well. So you see that including it in the paper is actually correlated with acceptance. And then the question, do you make your data set available for other people to look at? Obviously in anonymized or de-identified form. Turns out 23% of accepted papers did that. 40% of rejected papers. I don't think that that difference is significant, but it's an interesting difference. So again, we did the same thing with all of the human-centered AI studies at CHI from 2017 to 2024. The top demographics there are very similar. It's gender, age, education, and then origin, race, ethnicity, nationality. You see on the right here that almost no papers actually report all four of these, right? There were only 9 studies for which all 4 of these types of information were reported. And there's actually a really sizable chunk, about 27% of studies that don't report any of these demographics, right? So even though these are the top demographics, there's no real consensus on whether these demographics should be collected and or reported in the paper. And then there's also differences in how these demographics are reported. I'll give the example here for age, which we find that 60% of papers present some sort of a central tendency. So that's either the median or the mean. 51% of papers that report age report a range, so either a standard deviation or like minimum maximum. There are some papers that present some specific value or value ranges. And then there's a small percentage that kind of resorts to categories, right? Saying kind of the older category and the younger category, something like that. So this is still very much ongoing research. One of the next steps that we're going to do here from a practical perspective is to build an inventory of kind of standardized questions, right? Like what are the types of questions that you would want to ask in a study like this? Why would you or wouldn't you want to ask these questions? And what are different ways of asking these questions and what are the kind of privacy considerations about them? So we're hoping to use this data that we've collected to give some practical guidance and advice to researchers. Questions at this point?
We are good so far.
All right, and I will continue. All right, so the next question is, okay, if we're doing these types of studies, how do we communicate our data practices with study participants, and how do we work with the IRB to get ethics approval for our study. So for this, we went to the CHI papers of 2024, and we emailed a bunch of researchers asking them like, hey, you did a study with AI or with a large language model. Can we have an interview with you about this study? And 9 researchers actually responded to our request, and we had interviews with them. And so we asked them, what did you do to protect participant privacy and safety in your study? How did you inform participants about the research practices, particularly focused on the integration of AI in the study? How did you apply for ethics approval? And were there any negative kind of adverse events that happened during your study that you care to mention that could be interesting for other researchers? So first, when it comes to the protection mechanisms, we see a lot of researchers taking some very thoughtful considerations, right? So many of them said that they used the large language model APIs rather than the web interface to run their studies, which is good because the APIs, you can encrypt your data when you're communicating with the API. And also, most of these LLMs, when you use the API, you can set a flag that you do not want the LLM to use the data for training, which is a really good thing, right? So that was used to minimize data risk. They also said that when they collected the data themselves, they made sure that they encrypted that data and that they separated any personal identifiers that were used in the study from things that were collected during the study. And then for studies with children, they had additional considerations. They built some content filters into the LLM based on parental feedback to make sure that, things were appropriate for children, the responses of the LLM. And in some cases, when they had studies with children, they even would do like real-time supervision. So they actually had the child sit at the computer and the researcher kind of looking over their shoulder to make sure that nothing would go wrong, which is a really nice kind of non-technical way of helping with participant privacy that often gets overlooked. So I figured I'd mention it. There were also some kind of non-ideal practices here, right? So oftentimes researchers would use all kinds of different systems to collect the data. And so that would create kind of these fragmented data pipelines, right? They would use the ChatGPT API to do the LLM, but then they would store the data in Microsoft Azure, and they would use Qualtrics for demographics. It's good to separate data, but at the same time, if you need to protect all those pipelines, that can be a problem, right? So that was a potential issue. And then there were also researchers who had a little bit more of a laissez-faire perspective on these AI studies. They basically said, well, we send the data off to OpenAI, and we really don't know what they will do with it, right? And, that may sound a little cynical, but, to some extent, that's true when we trust these third-party platforms with the data of our study participants, right? We don't know what they will do with that data, and they don't always give guarantees about what they do, right? So, yeah, that is an issue that we have to deal with. In terms of informed consent, researchers mentioned that it was really important not just to get informed consent, but to really consider the informed part, right? They said that a lot of participants really lacked an understanding of where their data goes, right? Like one researcher said, like when we talk to participants, they sometimes think that the moment I close my browser window, my data gets deleted. That's obviously not true when you're dealing with all my systems, right? So some researchers did educate participants about this before running the study, but others didn't. And some even didn't mention the use of AI and LLM systems in their consent form at all. And I think that's a really big issue, right? When we use these types of systems, at the very least, participants should know about it. In terms of ethical approval, how does this fly under the radar? Well, a lot of ethics review boards don't really understand AI, right? Like they kind of examine that there's no real formal policies about the use of AI in human subject studies. So a lot of AIs kind of treat these studies on a case by case basis. Um, and they are IRBs are trained to look at kind of traditional data protection elements, right? Like data storage, confidentiality, things like that, and not about things like model training and third-party system use, right? So these are things that are often, IRBs struggle with identifying and then asking follow-up questions about. Um, Also, researchers are not always forthcoming, right? There was one researcher who mentioned initially we didn't even mention LLMs in our IRB application. And then when we did, suddenly the IRB had tons of questions for us, right? So it's important that you do mention this and that you have an honest conversation about it. But researchers were also frustrated that, once they did, again, there wasn't really kind of a guideline of like what they needed to report and what they needed to do, right? So they mentioned that they wanted more specific guidelines on how to deal with IRB and AI studies. In terms of adverse events, unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, we saw most adverse events happen in studies with vulnerable populations, right? On the one side, studies with children, we had a situation where a parent was concerned because they learned that their child had asked questions about sensitive anatomy to the AI chatbot, right? So this ended up resulting in these content filters. But there were also situations where children were sharing emotional issues with their chatbot, things that they hadn't even told their parents about, right? So now you're faced with a dilemma. Do I involve the parents in the data collection? On the one hand, you want to make sure to respect the parents' wishes and their care for their children. But on the other hand, if the child is saying things that they haven't even told their parents, that can lead to other types of issues, right? In studies with autistic individuals, there was one researcher who mentioned a ton of issues, right? There were participants who fell in love with their chatbots, who kind of had these kind of inappropriate relationships with their chatbot. And then one participant who decided, hey, I have this chatbot now. Why don't I make it do all my work? And so they just put their entire work packet into the chatbot. And the researcher had to contact the employer of this participant saying like, I'm afraid that your employee may have shared confidential information with a chatbot, right? So these are really kinds of studies where you have to be really careful in introducing these chatbots in these environments because the participants, these systems do sometimes inadvertently exploit the neurodivergence of study participants. And so you have to be really, really careful in running these types of studies. All right, so next steps here is we obviously only have interviewed 9 researchers for now, and we already have a ton of interesting information from that. We are looking to interview more researchers who have experience doing studies with AI. So if you are one of them, please do reach out, and we'd love to talk to you. We're also in the process of interviewing IRB administrators to find out where's the lack of knowledge coming from, and what are the kinds of resources that you need to be better prepared for kind of administrating these AI studies. And we want to talk to study participants, especially those from vulnerable populations, to ask them about their personal experiences in participating in these AI-based research studies. And the goal of all of this, again, is to develop some guidance for researchers and for ethics review boards to do a better job of dealing with participant privacy in these types of studies. So my final topic, okay, I see there's one question. I think in computer science, we often apply for IRB for an exempt research determination. Does that change for AI studies? Yes and no. I think in most cases, it's still exempt. But exemption does typically mean that either the data that you collect is fully anonymous, which again, with LLMs, you cannot always guarantee, or at least doesn't contain any sensitive information, which again, you cannot always guarantee. So um, I would say if you are unable to guarantee those things, confidentiality and or anonymity, or lack of sensitivity and or anonymity, then you may want to apply for expedited review rather than exempt review, right? That doesn't mean the end of the world. There's still a path forward for these studies, but it just means that an expert will end up looking at the study protocol, which I think is a good thing in most of these cases. So, yep, great. All right, so we'll now look at the final part here, which is, okay, if I'm gonna run one of these AI studies, I have all these decisions to make. How should I make these decisions? Right? So the question here is, how do research participants perceive your human-centered AI study, right? Now, we have done these interviews with researchers, and they have an idea, but they only have an idea for a very narrow sliver of human-centered AI studies, right? The studies that they ran. Right? So how do we contextualize this in the larger question of like, okay, how do I deal with consent, anonymization, data sharing, model training, right? Like we only know the studies that we ran. How do we look at kind of the broader perspective on this? And how do we so we want to know how people perceive studies depending on these different parameters, and how do those perceptions influence people's kind of tendency to actually participate in the study. So we ended up running this large-scale scenario-based study where we actually systematically manipulated these parameters to see how it influenced people's perceptions, how it influenced their intended participation rates. And so I'll talk a little bit about this study. So here is an example scenario. So each participant saw 12 of these. So you are invited to participate in a study on medical advice. During the study, you will act with ScienceGPT, a large language model developed by the National Science Foundation. That doesn't exist, but we had to come up with something. The data you provide during these interactions will be identifiable, meaning that your conversation will be linked to your name and email address. Your data will be stored for 2 months and may be used to improve the general accuracy of its responses. Additionally, your data can be reused for other purposes in the future by the same researchers. And once you agree to participate in the study, no further consent will be required for such future use of your data. Now, all the blue parts here are parameters in the scenario, which I will talk about on the next slide. But importantly, for each of these parameters, for each of these scenarios, we ask, are you willing to participate? Yes or no? And how comfortable are you with the LLM usage in this study? How useful do you think this study is? Do you feel like this is safe or risky? Do you think that it's appropriate to use LLMs for this purpose? How much do you trust the researchers doing this study, right? So we had these different, both a kind of tendency to participate as well as perceptions of the study. So here are the parameters. We have the topic sensitivity. The one that you saw, here's the one that you saw. So the one that you saw was a sensitive topic like medical data. The other one was movie recommendation. The LLM management, either an LLM managed by, in our case, the National Science Foundation, or managed by OpenAI, right? That's the public company. Then we have, how is the data anonymized? Was it fully identified or partially anonymized or fully anonymized? How long was the data retained? For 2 months, for 4 years, or indefinitely? Was the data used for model training? And if so, for kind of general model training or for personalization purposes? Was there additional data use either for the same researchers or also for others? And then would that additional data use be done without any required additional consent, with notification of additional use of the data, or with an option to opt in or opt out to these additional uses of the data? So these were the different parameters. If you multiply them all out, you get 864 different scenarios, right? And We kind of randomized this for participants. We did 12 per participant. We had over 100 participants. We did each scenario roughly twice. So this is an overview of the findings, right? So what you see here on the left is the different parameters. And you see that they influence people's perceptions of comfort, usefulness, risk, appropriateness, and trust. And that those perceptions in turn influence people's decision to participate, right? And what you can already see from this broad model is that some of these parameters have a stronger effect than others, right? So LLM management, whether it's the NSF or OpenAI that is managing the LLM, had no effect whatsoever, which we thought was very surprising. And some of these, like data use and training, did have a very limited effect on people's perceptions, whereas others had a more pervasive effect. So I'll walk through these different results in a little bit more detail. I'll speed up here a little bit because we're running out of time. So we see people are more likely to participate in a study with a non-sensitive topic about movie recommendation. You see it's about 67, 68% for movie recommendation study, about only 55% for a study about medical advice. And you can see that that depends on their level of comfort, their trust, the perceived safety of that study, the appropriateness of the LLM use. But interestingly, people did find the medical study more useful, right? So that was kind of an odd finding that even though the medical study was perceived as more useful, they were still more likely to participate in the studies about movie recommendation because of the higher level of trust and comfort in those studies. Data anonymization had perhaps the largest effect here, right? If you fully anonymize the data and you guarantee full anonymity, participation rates were up to like 80 something, 82, 83%. Whereas if you had fully identifiable studies, only about 40%, right? So that makes a huge difference. And partial anonymization was kind of in the middle here. And again, you can see that that is due to a higher level of comfort, usefulness, safety, appropriateness, and trust with these anonymized studies, right? Data retention had a weaker effect, but you can see that participation does go down the longer you keep the data, right? And again, that depends on perceptions. Model training, interestingly, people are more likely to participate if the data is used for model training. So this kind of suggests, and this has to do with usefulness and appropriateness, right? So people think, well, if you're not training the model, then why are you collecting my data, right? And so we need to maybe train people a little bit that yes, model training can indeed be useful and appropriate for an LLM study, but it can also entail additional risks, right? We did not find any effect in that regard, so we may need to educate participants a little bit more about that. Interestingly, for data use, additional data use, we only found a main effect on trust, where people were a little bit less trusting of researchers when they acknowledged that they would potentially also share their data with other researchers, but not just researchers, right? An interesting difference there, though, is that, well, first of all, that did not have a main effect on participation, but there was an interesting interaction effect with anonymization in that people were more likely to participate when the data was only used by the researchers themselves, except when the data was fully anonymized. Then they were actually more likely to participate if the data was used by researchers and others, right? So if you fully anonymize a study, people actually want the research to go out to as many people as possible, right? So this is a really good case for doing fully anonymized studies. In terms of additional consent for those additional data uses, people did want to be informed about future use of their data, but they didn't necessarily need an opt-in or opt-out mechanism. They felt that just being informed about it was already enough to be comfortable and trusting of these practices. And, you know, the participation rates didn't differ much between being informed or also having the option to opt in or opt out. An interesting interaction effect there was that this interacted with the amount of retention, right? So if you keep the data for a short amount of time, the red bullets here, that's only 2 months, or even 4 years, the green bullets here, there's no big difference between these different additional consent mechanisms. But the moment you keep the data indefinitely, people do want to have that ability to, even opt out of that if that's possible. So this might relate to an acknowledgement that, as these LLMs become more powerful, people realize, oh, if my data is used in the future, I want to have a little bit of say about that, right? We also find some interaction effects with demographics, right? So we find that women find medical studies less appropriate than the movie studies. And that difference was not there for men. Well, we have non-women here because we grouped the participants who didn't identify as women. This might have to do with the fact that medical studies about women can indeed be more sensitive, right? Like, especially when it's about things like reproductive health. And so you see that even though women are still, they are more likely to participate in, both men and women are more likely to participate in studies about movie recommendation, but that difference is stronger for women than for men in our studies. We also see a difference in additional data use. Women are less trusting of studies that share the data outside of the current researchers, whereas for men, we don't see a difference like that. We also see an interesting difference in age and anonymization, and that the youngest group of users, 18 to 24, they were more sensitive to anonymization. They were less likely to participate if the data was identifiable than their older peers, and they were just as likely to participate if there was full anonymization. So this might suggest that, the kids these days who use these systems on a daily basis, they realize that anonymization is really important because these systems use data for training and that data can be leaked indeed. Interesting differences with ethnicity. We find that in general, non-white participants are more skeptical about AI-based studies. They have a lower level of comfort. They see a lower level of safety. That says risk, it should say safety because it's the opposite of risk. And they are less likely to participate in studies. The difference is larger with full anonymization. So they do not trust the anonymization as much as white participants do. And again, this makes sense because they might be more easy to re-identify even with anonymized samples. So key takeaways from this study, how you conduct your study does affect participation, both in general and for specific groups. You may want to adapt your data practices to the sensitivity of the topic. You should anonymize your data collection. That seems to be really beneficial across the board. You don't have to over-engineer the consent mechanisms for future data use. Perhaps notifying participants is a good idea, though. That obviously has then consequences for anonymity, right? How can I notify you if the data is not anonymized? And there are some limitations to, you have to put in some limitations to data retention unless you provide some sort of an opt-out mechanism for future data use. And then it's also important to, again, to educate participants out about AI practices because they didn't seem to really understand these quite important differences in model ownership and model training, right? That did not have the effect that we expected based on our understanding of privacy. So I will do a very quick conclusion. I've talked to you about doing human subjects research for AI. I hope I've convinced you that it's a great way of doing studies on AI systems, that it's useful to do power analysis to determine your sample size or look at some of these local standards that we have collected. That you should collect demographics that are essential for your study. It is important to, for the fairness and the, to have a strong basis for your studies, but don't get too granular, right? And only collect the demographics that are necessary. You should educate your participants and potentially your local IRB about the privacy impacts of using AI in your study so that you can have a honest conversation about it. And then adjust your study parameters to optimize participation, also to make sure that you get a balanced sample, right? Because if women are less likely to participate in your study, that may, again, bias your sample in one way or the other. So with that, I thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer a few questions.
I'm going to grab the screen while people type.
Great.
Um, and so I can just uh, show what's coming up next month. So our next webinar is going to be Monday, June 23rd at 10 a.m. Central. Our topic is SciPDF, Usable Private Data Federation for Secure Scientific Collaboration. Our speaker is Cheng Hung Wang, and I will be sending out an announcement about that in a couple weeks. As always, you can view presentations um, by going to trustedci.org/webinars. Um, okay, so let me hop back to the chat. Um, I'll just wrap things up real briefly here. I wanted to acknowledge the role that you might have in presenting guidance to IRBs, because that is something that's kind of been discussed with Trusted CI, which is how do we have guidance to NSF projects about using AI? And so um, I'm very curious what the outcome of your research is and where you go from there. And we also have Bart providing his email. So with that, I think we're going to wrap things up. So thank you so much for presenting. I will, for those of you who are watching, I will be getting the video out later today so you can share with your colleagues. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks, Bart.
Thank you all for listening. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.